He is a very strong, very good leader. He's a nice man, but he can be nasty.
If he's a great man and you want to do a deal with Canada, why aren't you?
Because I want to be a great man too.
The final moment of that Oval Office meeting between the Prime Minister and the U.S. President, at least that we saw in public, and while it ended with a laugh, let's dig into some of the other key moments. To do that, I'm joined by the CBC's Katie Simpson from outside the White House, and here with me in the studio is the CBC's chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. Okay, so a big day, seemingly. I just want to get to a Dominic LeBlanc clip before we get you to weigh in, because he spoke not that long ago, because after the closed-door meetings, Dominic LeBlanc spoke with reporters, and here's what he had to say about those meetings and what is going to happen next.
The conversation, as I said, was more detailed than previous discussions. It concluded with the President and the Prime Minister directing us, me and my colleagues and the President, his cabinet secretaries who were there, to continue the conversation and to quickly land deals that will bring, we think, greater certainty in areas where the principal areas would be steel and aluminum and energy.
Okay, Katie, no deal, but more talks. What's the latest from on the ground there in Washington, D.C.?
It is our understanding that Dominic LeBlanc, I believe, David, you've been reporting that he is going to be staying for further talks and the conversations are going to continue. It sort of has the same sentiment, the same feeling as after the meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump after the G7 in Kananaskis. Remember when Mark Carney walked out and said, listen, we're aiming to reach a deal within 30 days, and he said that a deal or a deadline will focus the mind. Well, now Dominic LeBlanc says, look, we're working to try to get this quickly, but he's not offering any sort of specific timeline because Canada in the past, as we saw in that previous example, got burned when trying to sort of reach toward a specific timeline. This was not the expectation that senior Canadian government sources had sort of set out heading into this meeting. They had always cautioned, though, that things can go sideways, that an expectation is very different than a guarantee, and dealing with Donald Trump is not a guarantee. And while everyone inside the Oval Office during the public part of that meeting, it seemed cheerful. It seemed like there was some momentum, that the relationship between Carney and Trump is in a good space. They joked, they complimented one another. But then, the reality of this moment, that underlying tension that exists in the Canada-U.S. relationship, all the jokes and the laughs, you can't sort of avoid that. Donald Trump addressing it directly, describing it sort of as the natural conflict, that Canada and U.S. are neighbors and they're going to be competing for business. Donald Trump very specifically targeting the auto sector. While his language is a little bit softer than previous meetings, saying things like, we don't want their cars, we don't want their lumber. He did still say, listen, we are in competition for these factories. We are in competition for these plants. But he did offer some optimism to Canada, saying that, we want to see Canada do well. That's one of the comments he made there. But all of that aside, they can be as complimentary and positive and optimistic as you want. We're here at 5:05 p.m. Eastern Time. And what is tangibly new?
Yeah.
What do we have to grab onto to say what's new here? And right now, I got talks are continuing. That's new. But is there something that's going to change to make the lives of Canadians any better? Nope.
Yeah, Rosie, Katie's comparison to what we saw at the G7, right? When Ambassador Hillman and Dom LeBlanc came out and said we've been directed to proceed with urgency within 30 days. That was 114 days ago, right? And here we are. Now, the president seemingly giving some direction. That may be something that helps propel things, but I don't know. Where do you think we are?
Well, a couple of things. Not only is Dominic LeBlanc staying, but the Prime Minister is staying until tomorrow. Yep. And Ashley Burke tells us from her sources that the Prime Minister is actually having a working dinner with the Vice President. So that as well is I would say, significant in terms of trying to move things forward. I completely agree with Katie. Whether things look different tomorrow, I don't know. But the work is going to continue, it sounds like, through the evening and into tomorrow, not just at the ministerial level, but also at the level of the Prime Minister. I would also just point to the comments that Dominic LeBlanc made to reporters, where he said, knowing that he's not going to fall into the trap of giving a deadline as he did before, that he does feel that there is momentum that they didn't have even this morning. And I think that speaks to the leader-to-leader conversation, right? The fact that if you get in a room with Donald Trump, you can push him to get somewhere. The other thing that Dominic LeBlanc talked about was whether when the president references formulas that they're working on, whether that is in fact something to do with quotas. And in fact, Dominic LeBlanc said that we shouldn't put a straight line between that idea, quotas and formulas, that there's lots of different things that could be discussed. He talked about anything from joint partnerships, joint ventures. So that that begins to open up a much broader conversation about what kind of investments the United States might be looking for, whether they want a part of or a piece of something. So I would say very much that the story isn't over for this meeting even, forget for a deal. I think that we are still in the midst of the conversation. And I would also say that as you well know, and as Katie well knows, there's a very tight lid on this stuff, right? This is happening in a very small group of people. And LeBlanc made it very clear that they had committed to the White House that they would not be talking much about any of the details of what is on the table.
Yes, it was very non-specific beyond the categories of what they talked about. This was one of the demands from the president, as I understand it, very early in these conversations, frustrated by, well, Katie, you would know well, the scrums outside the USTR building where Chrystia Freeland, when negotiating back in the day, would talk about everything. But Katie, in listening to Minister LeBlanc today, it sounds like Mark Carney gave some sort of a pitch or presentation on ways that the two countries can cooperate and work together to the president, and the president gave direction to move ahead on steel and aluminum to his cabinet officials. Is that how you interpret what seemingly happened there today, at least directionally?
That's the sense I'm getting. And while it all seems extremely sort of like, okay, there's momentum here, there seems to be a positive rapport between the leaders, and it is well known in Washington and beyond that, you know, Donald Trump can be swayed. And if you try and make a pitch to him and sort of make a case of why it's in America's interest to do something, that he will listen. He is open to sort of listening to these kinds of pitches. For a very long time, Donald Trump very fundamentally believes that on the issue of trade, America has been ripped off. It's something that comes up time and time again. Part of the reason why he has such an animosity toward Chrystia Freeland, who negotiated Canada's, helped renegotiate the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, is because from his perspective, someone has sort of shaped his view that she got a better deal for Canada than Canada deserved, that she somehow ripped America off. And that is something that fundamentally is at the core of Donald Trump's sort of America First agenda when it comes to trade. He views America as a country that's been ripped off for decades, and he wants to put an end to that with his America First agenda. And so that, Mark Carney can go in there and make pitches, and that's the best way to make change. Getting FaceTime with U.S. President Donald Trump is nothing to it's a massive, massive thing to do, and it's an opportunity for Canada to really make that case. But the way that the message generally needs to be shaped in order to sort of sway Donald Trump is, why is this in your best interests to do this for your people? And that's the way it sort of needs to be shaped.
Yeah, and Rosie, getting him to ease up, get his boot off the neck of the Canadian economy by giving him something that looks like a win without it being too much of a win because of what that would represent. But, there was an expectation built up to today that has not been met, at least as of right now.
Right.
And so, how do you expect that to play, at least in the reaction in the specific sectors and politically, because there's a lot of pressure being put on him, the Prime Minister, before he went to Washington?
Yeah, and pressure of his own creation, let's be honest, right? All the way back to the election campaign, and since then, as you talked about, the various deadlines that he and his ministers set for themselves, and then the moves to back down from things that they had put in place that were upsetting the president. I would say a couple of things to me seem a little bit different from this conversation today, and we'll see whether I'm reading it correctly or not. The first is, it was Donald Trump who said multiple times during that conversation that he thought things could get done and that Canadians would love the U.S. again. So it wasn't the Prime Minister saying that. That was the President saying that he thought Canada would be happy with where they ended up. The other thing that seems to me different, and Dominic LeBlanc referenced this as well, is the way that the President was talking about the challenges with Canada and the United States, talking about how it is more difficult because of the proximity of the two countries.
The integration,
The integration, the free trade deal, which, is in place technically, and the fact that we are competing for sometimes the same things. I mean, that is an area, I'm not sure that we've heard the president explain it in that way before. Certainly we know that we're competing for industries, except for in the case of the Prime Minister of Canada, he believes that should remain a collaboration rather than a competition. But I think to hear directly from the president some hope, some optimism about something that would keep Canada happy, and we should be clear, no one thinks that means no tariffs, but something more predictable and stable for certain sectors, I think is what we're talking about here. And if they can get there on steel and aluminum, which is the most punishing tariff that is having the most damage on those industries, that would be a win. But again, it sounds like conversations continue, and maybe we won't get a resolution tonight or tomorrow either.
No, I mean, here we are. The meeting is over. There's going to be another meeting between the Prime Minister and J.D. Vance this evening, but the tariffs remain in place today. There may be some movement. We're 10 months into the Trump presidency, 38 months to go. Katie, we're going to probably check in with you a little bit later. As things develop, CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington and the CBC chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. Okay, well, Carney's point man in the U.S. trade talks is Minister Dominic LeBlanc, and here is LeBlanc's assessment of the meeting with President Trump.
I thought it was the first time that I'd seen the president speak publicly in detail about how difficult necessarily these conversations are, because we have probably the two most integrated economies in the world in terms of trading partners of the United States. It's a different circumstance than doing a deal with a country that's an ocean away. I remain optimistic, and I'm more optimistic today after those discussions at the White House than I was when we arrived in Washington yesterday, but recognize that we still have some work to do.
Okay, we're going to pick up there with the power panel. Supriya Dwivedi is here. She was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Emily Nicola is a columnist for Le Devoir. And here with me in the studio is Anne McGrath, who is the former director of the New Democratic Party. Good to see you all. Dom LeBlanc, Lisa says he's more optimistic than he was yesterday. I don't know if I'm any more enlightened than I was yesterday. What's your read of what came out of these meetings in the Oval Office?
Well, I think we've got a lot more clarity on one particular topic that's very important to me personally, and that's the auto sector, especially in southwestern Ontario. I just think it's important to remember that it's 500,000 jobs in this country that's involved in the supply chain and the auto sector, including the small tier 1 and tier 2 parts manufacturers, the plastics, the logistics change, the whole thing. It's really important. And President Trump basically said today, he doesn't want Canada to have an auto sector, that he wants to have it for himself. It was repeated many, many times over and over again, that seems to be what his end game is, specifically in the auto sector. And I didn't see a lot of pushback at that point in time, in that moment, from the Prime Minister, which may very well be a move that he made in order to make sure that he got out of this press conference alive. But the reality is that it's too important a piece of employment infrastructure in this country to be put on the table and chopped up in terms of a quota. And I hope that when they are talking about the deal, that they're not just talking about whether or not they're going to put a cap on how much Canada can export, but as well, they're going to deal with the non-tariff problems we're having in that sector right now, which is basically U.S. government kind of winking and nodding to the auto companies saying, do you really think you have that great amount of certainty doing business in Canada right now? Don't you think you should move to the States?
Yeah, Supriya, there was a point where the president said, we want Canada to make cars, but he made very clear he didn't want them selling it to America, right, is how I read it. And also, when Minister LeBlanc came out of there today, the direction was to work on steel and aluminum. Right? It's limited, Supriya, in the scope. And even there's not clarity. I mean, what do you take from what we heard?
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Lisa said. And to her point about, I don't think the Prime Minister here was in a position where he could have publicly pushed back with the kind of force that I think we would expect him to do so behind closed doors when there are no cameras around. By the way, I'm not suggesting Lisa was saying that he should do that, but just, I think we need to be mindful of the fact that there's two very different negotiations or presentations that are happening. There's one that happened in front of the camera and there's one that's going to happen behind closed doors. And I think increasingly the risk here for Carney and the rest of the Liberal government right now is that I think Canadians are reasonable, and we see whether the PM is Carney right now or Trudeau in the past. There is no value in having our Prime Minister antagonize Trump this way, and we value our Prime Minister acting responsibly and diplomatically. But increasingly, there's going to be a risk if there's no trade deal to speak of, or there's a kind of crappy trade deal or a suboptimal trade deal. Then the Canadians are going to start to ask what all this was for, really. And I think there's a lot of pressure right now. And I agree with Minister LeBlanc that there's reason to be optimistic, but we have to go at some point between like feelings and vibes to concrete something or other.
Okay, I just want to play a clip that reinforces the point about the Prime Minister not litigating the point with the President. Because at one point, a reporter asked President Trump if the fentanyl crisis was over, and that was his purported reason for the first round of tariffs that he implemented at the beginning of the year. Just have a look at this exchange.
No, it's not over. I think it's never going to be over, frankly. But Canada's worked hard, and they've done a much better job than in the past.
Any amount is too much. So we've gotten it down. It's down substantially. It's less than 1%, but it's still too much. It's too much at home in Canada.
A lot of people.
Yeah, we got to stand.
Right. So, and I think it's a good illustration of the way the Prime Minister is dealing with the President, that he reinforced Canada's point that we're not a big part of your problem, but then acknowledged, yes, any amount is too much. He's not going to sit there and fight with him over whether Canada is the problem or not. You know what I mean? He sort of avoids that because it derails everything, but here we are. He took that approach. What do you think?
Well, I thought it was interesting in that exchange, actually, because as has been commented many times today, Trump spoke for most of that news conference.
Same as in May.
Yeah, Carney said very little, and it looked to me like he was asking for permission to speak at that point. You know, he tapped him, and it was like he wanted to say something, but he had to get permission to do that. I feel like, to Supriya's point about, the kind of what is this all about, I feel a bit naive for feeling so let down by today. Because I think that there were those moments in that news conference. It sounded like something big was going to happen, and I kind of got my hopes up because I hadn't been expecting a lot, and then my hopes really went up by the tone of that news conference. Even though, of course, it's always cringy to watch these things, but my hopes were up, and then there was nothing there, and there has to be something. I mean, I'm heartened by the fact that the talks are going to continue, but there has to be something substantial there, and that's, I think, the big danger is if it's too little.
Right, and Emily, this is part of the problem of interpreting Donald Trump in real time. Because we've learned this when he puts out a social media blast, putting tariffs here and this thing there, and then you see the fine print. It's not actually as kind of advertised. And he praised the Prime Minister today. He praised Canada today. He did that back in May. And then he doubled tariffs and steel and aluminum. You know what I mean? So the vibes are one thing. The actions are another.
You're right. At the same time, what happened today isn't new information. Going back to Lisa's comment about Donald Trump wanting to destroy the Canadian auto sector, this is something that's been very clear for months now in several of his speeches. And the fact that we in Canada have so many jobs relying on the auto sector while not having a Canadian, there's not Canadian cars out there. We're not owning those companies. It was always a weakness. And now we're being exposed to that. But if somebody wants to launch a car business in Canada, now would be the time. Otherwise, it's going to be an issue, I think, for several years to come, as long as that is the vision in the United States. And so what I saw today was Mark Carney trying to essentially save the furniture on steel and aluminum and the other things that can still be worked on. And I want to just say this, there is perhaps some advantages to the CUSMA deadline still being on the horizon and us trying to only negotiate some tariffs and taking some more time to negotiate the broader agreement. And that might be that between now and the next couple of months and year, we're going to be witnessing several issues in terms of democracy in the United States itself, freedom of expression, and even the state of the freedom of election for the midterm, as the president is now sending the army in some large American cities. And there are ways for Canada. Canada already has commercial relationships with countries that are not democracies, but those commercial relationships are different than those that are part of the liberal democracy bloc that we've had since the Second World War. And we need to keep in mind that we might very well be looking at be building a commercial relationship with a regime that does not look like us anymore, and that entails some other level of complexities. And so if we do have the luxuries of time to figure out what we do with our commercial relationship with the US, that might not be the worst thing in the world, given that what I just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point there, and the fundamental nature of the United States does seem to be changing in real time, but 70, 80,000 jobs have been lost over the course of the year because of this, Lisa, and you heard the president there today saying that at some point we want the same business. And the way he talks about countries is either as a competitor, as a customer, as a supplier, but almost never as a partner. And that's what this has been built around for decades, and that is on the table right now. Even with the positivity on it, he just laid out, yeah, we want all of these things that you have, and we have the big market, and we're going to use it.
Yeah, and he made another announcement last week that made my blood run cold as well, and that was the 100% tariff on foreign films. Canada has a production industry in this country that employs about 330,000 people in BC and Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. That's a really big and important industry for us as well, and he's zeroed in on it. Now, they're a little bit away. They're investigating it right at the moment, but he's identified yet something else that we're competitive with, that we're close with, that he can say to the heads of studios and the film producers, why are you doing this in Canada? You should do it down here. And he zeroed in specifically on these tax credits that we give as municipalities, as feds, or as provinces. Every day is a new day, David. It's like whack-a-mole. You think you got one thing sorted and then another one comes. But I will tell you one thing, what I found interesting. I was talking to some people who live in Oakville about the auto sector. It's very top of mind. Yeah. The number one thing that they think of isn't about people losing their jobs. They jump right to the end point, which is, oh my gosh, the value of my home is going to decrease significantly. That's the fear that people who aren't part of the sector have. It's the ongoing impact it's going to have on the real estate residential sector.
Right, and you know, as this continues, right, the political heat and the political pressure on top of the personal and economic anxiety, that builds, because today in Toronto, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, he spoke briefly before today's meeting at the White House, and Ford wants decisive and strong action from the federal government if there is no relief from tariffs.
There has to be a point that if Prime Minister Carney can't get a deal, we have to start hitting back. We need to hit back hard. We can't just keep rolling over to President Trump. As he strengthens his case, we seem to be weakening our case by continuously pulling off tariffs. Maybe Prime Minister Carney knows something I don't know. And if that's the case, he should sit down with the premiers and explain that.
Supriya, as we were listening to that in real time earlier today, I was thinking this is not good news for the Prime Minister because that has been, you know, the Dave Semenko to his Wayne Gretzky, to use the hockey analogy, right? The enforcer who will go into the corners, and Doug Ford, and he seems to be getting disappointed.
Yeah, and look, the CPC has already put out something onto their socials that attacks Carney for the way he talked on the campaign trail versus the Prime Minister today, you know, laughing alongside President Trump as he suggested the merging of our two countries. And I would expect a lot more of that thing to be deployed by the opposition and not just the Conservatives. And then on top of that, you have a friendly Conservative in Premier Ford, right, who up until this point has been his enforcer, has been the Captain Canada, along with the Prime Minister. And so, you know, if Canada is going to have this image that Premier Ford is putting out there that we're getting bullied, which arguably we are, right? I don't think anybody anybody would really disagree with that, in the form of these tariffs, that we can't just sit there and keep getting clocked in the face. We're going to have to punch back at some point. And that message is going to be increasingly hard for the Carney government to kind of push aside as they're negotiating, these deals behind closed doors without very many details that are being given to the public, without very many assurances or very many timelines being given to the public. And so everything's just mounting. Like, the stakes are just getting higher and higher, and things are going to become increasingly difficult for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, so, and I can see the desire and the impulse to hit back. I get the cathartic value, the strategic value, though, because, you have to be careful of how hard you go with this particular president because of, he can counterpunch even higher. Like, how do you calibrate this if you're the Prime Minister right now?
Well, that's hard because maybe and maybe not, right? I mean, like, if we continually capitulate, and I think that one of the things that Premier Ford is very good at is kind of capturing what people are feeling. And it gets, despite his problems with speed cameras and tunnels and green belts and all of those kinds of things, he, on this file, he manages, I think, to kind of go to what people are feeling. And people are feeling a bit bullied, obviously, because we are being bullied.
Yeah.
But people feel bullied. They feel the cringiness, as I said before, of those meetings where you have to sit there and smile at outrageous things that he says, whether it's about, men and women, men in sports and all of those kinds of all of the things that he says, you have to sit there and not react. And so people feel like, what are we getting from all of this? And there is also underlying all of that a feeling that we've already given up a lot. We gave up, whether you love them or not, the digital services tax, the reciprocal tariffs, all of those kinds of things. So I think Doug Ford is speaking to really the emotions that people have around this.
No, look, he's not unlike Trump in that way, in that they can sense the mood of a population, right? Like, this is something Donald Trump is quite good at. That's the only comparison I'm making between Doug Ford and Donald Trump. I want to be very clear, political instinct to read the room. But, I get, Emily, where the Premier is coming from, right? Because he has been, leading the charge on a lot of this at the subnational level, pulling booze off the shelves and threatening to cut off electricity flows. I guess the challenge is in not knowing what is actually being said in these meetings. You don't know the benefit or the disadvantage of taking counteraction at this point, right?
Absolutely, we don't know. I do hope, though, that someone like Doug Ford, given the importance of the economic sectors that are being impacted by this decision, I would hope that someone like that might be, off the record, very much quickly kept in the know. So that might be really helpful in terms of aligning interests and not getting punched domestically for doing your best abroad. That being said, I think a lot of people in Canada are not used to what is a very normal feeling for a lot of citizens in the global south, which is you just don't have the power. And so you're forced to take decisions domestically that are not in your national interest, because it's that or a threat of invasion or some retaliation that is very destructive, even to your social fabric or even to your democracy. I'm speaking right now from Bogota. I'm actually in Colombia for work right now, and there's a lot of countries in this region here in South America who knows exactly what Canadians are feeling today. And so it might be new for some of us, but it's not a new feeling. And I think because it's new for some of us, what might happen is that we might take that anger on each other while it's actually not our fault. And it might actually rile up a lot of people domestically to actually point fingers at each other for not doing enough, while actually we're just a smaller economy than the United States. And if they're behaving hostile, there's only so much that we can do. And so we want to do as much as we can do, but there is that discrepancy that's always been there in Canada-US relationship. We're just feeling it now, perhaps more than ever, but it's not a new reality.
Yeah, Lisa, what are your thoughts on that, like the position the Premier is laying out there? Because yes, things have gone away, but in negotiations, you do have things on the table. So you have the option of taking them off, to gain concessions. So far, we've only seen things coming off and not necessarily any gains. So you can see why someone like Doug Ford is frustrated. What's your thoughts on his stance there?
So I think the last line was the most important line in what the premier said, which was the prime minister needs to meet with the provinces. And I think the frustration is kind of what you've been talking about this entire show, which is the opaqueness of these negotiations at the moment. That's a theme that we're hearing from all of the panelists today, that it's behind closed doors. Canadians don't really know what's going on, but it appears as well premiers are getting a little concerned. They don't know what's going on. And Doug Ford knows exactly how much and how important film and auto is to the Ontario economy. And I'm sure he's wondering, what are you negotiating? And can we understand what it all means? And maybe is there going to be support for Ontario at the end if you've decided that the auto industry is the thing that we're going to give on in order to get everything else back on an even keel?
Yeah, and steel as well, right? I mean, Hamilton and the Sioux. I mean, Doug Ford's probably the most trade-exposed premier out there, right? Based on the nature, the fundamental, or one of them, what the fundamental nature of the economy.
Yeah, St. John, New Brunswick is number one.
Yes,
and I only bring that up, David, because a major shipping line announced this week that they're stopping their stop in the port of St. John's. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal. They've decided to reroute their traffic into the United States.
Right. So, Supriya, I mean, how do you calibrate this going forward, right? We saw Pierre Poilievre release this letter that he sent to the Prime Minister on Sunday saying no more losing, come back with something. I don't know if the Prime Minister is going to come back with something. He's going to be having dinner with J.D. Vance tonight. I don't know if that can advance things or not. How do you calibrate this if the premiers are starting to get a little bit restless? Because the opaque flow of information is kind of a feature of this government, not just around this issue. It's kind of a broadly applied thing.
Yeah, look, the only thing the prime minister is getting out of a dinner with the vice president is eyeliner tips at this point. Like, I don't think they're going to come away with anything super concrete here. But I think, to Lisa's point about needing to meet with the provinces, they probably should have done that going into this meeting to let the premiers know, this is what's going on. This is what we're going to get. These are the major sticking points. We're probably going to make, some progress on A, B, and C, but D and E are really still kind of here, but we're going to keep working towards it so that you didn't have Premier Ford come out today and say that, we got to hit back and question the Prime Minister going into these sorts of things. So the best time to do it was yesterday, but I guess as good a time as any is as soon as possible.
And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually a bit interesting to me that he didn't do that prior to this meeting, because up till now, I've had this sense that he's been a bit more open to meeting with the premiers than previous governments have been. And I include both Harper and Trudeau in that. It's usually the stance of the Prime Minister is to avoid things like First Ministers meetings and conferences, the Federation, Council of the Federation, and those kinds of things. But this government seems to be very interested in keeping the premiers engaged and involved in all of that kind of thing. But right now, we're seeing some fracturing of that as well, right? Like, we're seeing some conflict between EB and Smith. We're seeing...
I would say it's more than some, but yes, I take your point,
We're seeing the Doug Ford, like it's kind of falling apart a little bit. So it's surprising to me that he wouldn't have done that. So I think that's right. He should have done it beforehand, and he should definitely do it right away.
Yeah, we did an interview with Danielle Smith actually earlier today, and we're going to hear that in the second hour, plus David Eby's reaction. And actually, Wab Kinew is connecting, so he's going to be here live any minute now, the Premier of Manitoba. But, Emily, I guess this is the challenge. If you promise the president you're not going to talk too much about the granular details, and then you bring 13 subnational governments into the loop, you have to either keep it very high level, or you run the risk of things potentially leaking out in different places, and maybe jeopardizing things, right? So it's a Hobbesian choice, kind of, no matter what you do when you're dealing with an agent like Donald Trump here.
Yes, and so this is why in times of crisis, a lot of times the governments tend to decrease democracy, not because democracy is bad, it's just because when you have multiple people discussing against an authoritarian regime, it's not necessarily up to your advantage, for example, in wartime. And so it's now we're not at, there's a commercial war going on, and it's the fact that there is multiple people in charge and a lot of different sub-level level of governments in Canada is actually not helping. If we were a centralized government, and I would actually make Mark Carney's job easier, but that's not just what Canada is, and so we'll need to deal with that. And I think even having this conversation right now, and doing, saying what I'm saying right now might be good for the Prime Minister to say that we're stuck with the fact that that we need to be understanding that this can be played against us essentially, and that we need to be smart in the way we both play politics the way we're used to be playing politics, but at the same time understand that there are some broader things at stake now, and that if people are not conscious of that, and by people I mean premiers, we might actually end up shooting ourselves in the foot.
So Lisa, the way to ease some of the anxieties is for there to be some quick progress, or at least certainty on some of the key sectors, right? That coming out of this soon in the world of politics and trade, there is some clarity on what's going to happen with steel and aluminum. Now, Dominic LeBlanc is going to stay and continue these meetings. I mean, what are you watching for the next signs? We have a statement from the Steel Producers Association saying they're pleased to see that they have constructive dialogue, encouraged to hear substantive discussions. But, you know, that's again, we're back to vibes over hardcore details. So what are you watching for here?
I'm watching to see whether or not Donald Trump has decided if he wants to do a deal with Canada, David. I don't want to be defeatist in all of this, but I don't think this is a president that you can make come to the party prior to him wanting to be there to do a deal. And quite frankly, he seems to be reveling in the uncertainty. Maybe they should make a bet on the World Series. Perhaps that'll be the way to get this thing fleshed out. All on the line if the Toronto Blue Jays win. Now I've gone and hexed us, so I apologize.
Yeah, he's got the field there, right? Because all the other teams are American, right? So that gives you at least he gets a numerical advantage, even if he's probably a bit of a backslider of a New York fan. You know, Supriya, like we're 10 months in to 48 months of this presidency. There's 38 months to go, and there's no resolution on the sectoral tariffs. And Kuzma hasn't even really started in earnest, right? And so like Lisa, I try not to be defeatist, but you look at the road behind us and the much longer road ahead, and the potholes just get larger.
Yeah, and I mean, that's presuming Trump leaves office in 2028. Like, he's selling Trump 2028 merch and is openly saying that he's not really going to leave. So I don't know if we should be assuming that he's not going to try and at least attempt to stick around during the next presidential go. And yeah, it's a long slog. And sorry to say, but I think out of all of us, I'm probably the most defeatist. So I don't really have a ton of cheer to give other than, you know, we just have to ensure that we're sort of banded together and all rowing in the same direction. And it doesn't help the federal government once you start getting premiers, you know, rightfully, because they have to protect their own provinces and their own sectorals that are being impacted here, if they're not rowing in the same direction. And the more this drags on, the harder it's going to be to get everybody to keep rowing.
Right. So, and I think the last time there's going to be a First Ministers meeting next month at the Grey Cup, as we keep getting reminded. November 16th in Winnipeg, by the way.
We're living our political life through the sports calendar.
Well, exactly. It's Grey Cup, World Cup, Stanley Cup is sort of the benchmarks we're told. And I can see the Premier of Manitoba standing by, so this will be the final point, because he obviously wants the Bombers to be in that Grey Cup. But the last meeting, everyone was pretty good. The Premiers were all behind Mark Carney. A lot has happened since then, though. You know, if you look at this potential frame, I mean, what does the Prime Minister do, you know, when he gets back from Washington? Do you think he needs to reach out and have this chat earlier?
Well, I think he does, and I think it should be sooner. And I think that, you know, we've been talking about the fact that there's so little information about what's being talked about. I think that the premiers, and I know that there is a risk of things getting out, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, because people do want to know what's happening. And so, you know, maybe a few kind of leaks wouldn't be a bad thing. And I think that getting the premiers at least kind of rowing together a little bit more. I mean, they're not going to resolve some of these conflicts. They're long-standing conflicts.
The pipeline fight is the pipeline fight.
That's right. That's not going to be resolved. But if they can get them on the same page around the tariffs, I think that would be significant.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there because Wab Canoe is in the queue. I want to thank the power panel, Supriya Dwivedi, Lisa Raid, Emily Nicola, and Emma McGrath. Thank you all so much.